Okay, we're going to get started. This room is sponsored by Rubicon. The Rubicon project has engineered the Advertising Automation Cloud, one of the largest real-time cloud and big data computing systems. The company's mission is to automate the buying and selling of advertising by offering innovative products to connect buyers and sellers globally. For more information, visit rubiconproject.com. We also encourage you to visit the feedback survey. It's on the same page as your name badge. We appreciate any feedback to help us with future SCaLE events. Okay, our session is Solving Humanity's Grand Challenges. Our speaker is Jono Bacon, who probably needs no introduction. Nonetheless, he will be speaking. He's the Senior Director of Community Data XPRIZE, and he will walk through the goals and focus of XPRIZE and show how he is working on a global community designed to help solve these grand challenges, including education, healthcare, space travel, and life sciences. Without further ado, I give you Jono Bacon.
Thank you. How's everyone doing? You know how the drill works. How's everyone doing? Come on. Yeah, there we go. I'm not going to do that whole stupid thing that George likes. So I just want to first of all say a big thank you for you folks actually showing up. I was quite petrified knowing that I was going to be in this room. And it's Sunday, and so thank you everybody for coming along, particularly as probably most of you have no idea what the hell this is going to be about. Work, flicker. Work, flicker. Let's try that again. You know what? I'm stood next to it. Hang on. Work, flicker. There we go. All right, so I joined a place called XPRIZE. Anyone know what XPRIZE is? A couple of you. Brilliant. That's actually more than I expected. I spent some time at Canonical working as the Ubuntu community manager, and I used to run a consultancy practice, and this is going to make sense a little bit later on, but I'm really passionate about how we build strong and empowered communities, and doing the consultancy was a great way of learning more about how we do this. You know, the way Canonical works and how you build a community and the way we do it in open source is going to be very different if you're working with Deutsche Bank or Samsung or Deloitte or people like that. Wrote a book called The Art of Community, and some of you may realize that I share the same idiotic podcast with the other three idiots in Bad Voltage. So this is, frankly, quite a selfish presentation. Usually when you go to a presentation, you go there to soak up knowledge, whereas I want to turn this around a little bit and soak up your knowledge. And this will become clear in a little bit. I was born, well, I used to live when I was a kid in a place that looked a little bit like this. This is Bedfordshire. Anyone been to Bedfordshire? Yeah, idiot. So I mean that in the nicest possible way. When I was a kid, my parents, my aunties and uncles and other people said, you know what, people don't know their neighbors like they did back in the good old days. This was a thing that I heard repeatedly over and over again. And the general narrative about this is that communities are dead. They don't really exist anymore. Video games and movies are rotting our brains. We don't talk to each other. We don't hang out with each other. But what's interesting is that in the last sort of 5 to 10 years, we've seen local farming groups getting together to teach kids how to grow sustainable produce. We've seen the incredible story of Wikipedia happening where we document human knowledge. We've seen just the incredible breadth and spread of open source, which is now running the infrastructure of the world, the devices in your pocket, the banking systems, organizations everywhere running open source. And then, of course, we've seen the maker revolution that's happening now with 3D printing and with drones and all kinds of things as well. But these communities also have formed in other areas, such as profound political change, like the Arab Spring, and obviously the Charlie Hebdo shootings as well. We saw some rallies and some togetherness there as well. So this, to me, has begged the question, why? Why do we do this? Why do we get together in groups to further a mission, to further a cause? And as I said earlier on, I'm passionate about how communities work. I don't just want to learn how to build a good community for whoever I work for or for the podcast that I'm on. I want to try and understand how communities can work in lots of different areas. So I looked over history a little bit, and of course you can see all these different revolutions that have happened over the years. The transportation revolution, which helped us to ship things around the world, the industrial revolution, which helped us to make things en masse, of course the computing revolution, which put a computer in every pocket, in every office, We connected those computers together with the internet, and then 3D printing most recently is democratizing manufacturing. It's incredible. And what's interesting is all of these revolutions are connected. The transportation revolution led to the industrial revolution, which led to the computing revolution, and so on and so forth. And if you look at the benefactors and the constituents in these revolutions, it's people. And one of the things that struck me as I've gotten older is that we often forget that we're people, that we're all animals. And when you take away the computers and the screens and the tables and the chairs, we're just people. And everything that's powered my personal philosophy in how we build strong communities is I believe that most people are good people. I think most of us generally want to have a positive impact out there. And if we look at people, if we put good people together with other good people, we invariably make a better planet. There was a really interesting study done recently, a book actually was published, where they put a bunch of liberals together in a room with a bunch of liberals, and they became more liberal. And they did the same thing with conservative people, and they became more conservative. So therefore, conceivably, if you put really good people in a room with really good people, you get great people. That's the reason why we should build communities all over the world. Okay? So I believe the way in which we make a better planet is to build great communities. And that's what I've devoted my peanut-sized brain to. I think if you also look at people at the most basic level, is that all of us want to live a life of dignity. Okay? Everyone in the world, everyone in this room, everyone outside of this room, we all want to live a life of dignity. But to live a life of dignity, we need to feel a sense of self-worth. And to feel that sense of self-worth, we feel like we need to be able to contribute. It's to contribute to our families, to our local communities, to our businesses, to our projects, to our clubs. But to be able to contribute, we need access. And my good friend over here has lectured me repeatedly that this is the wrong word to describe this point, so forgive me for a second. But what I mean by this is access to knowledge and access to tools, to the things that we need to be able to contribute. So if you look at all of these things that have happened over the years, I believe that the reason why they're happening, and the reason why many more great stories of communities getting together, is going to be because of access. It's because we're getting better and better access to the tools and technologies to do better things. So if you look at that and we break that access down, one of the first areas to look at is technology. Technology has got this incredible exponential growth curve, and we know this with Moore's law. If you follow this trend, this is awesome but worrying. So what we can see here is that there's certain things that we're AI, someone shout over there, there's certain things that are incredibly processor intensive, that are, the processing power bottleneck is no longer going to be much of an issue. But of course, computing power is one thing. What we really need to do is to connect those things together. So if we look at the internet, now I apologize, this is a slightly older graph. It goes up to 2009. But what's evident here is that internet access is growing throughout the world, not just in Western countries, but more and more poorer nations as well are getting connected. But they're not getting connected together via their desktop computers, via their laptops. They're getting connected via cell phones. And this shows the growth of cell phones across the world as well. This is where, for example, I think Firefox OS are doing a really, really good job because they're trying to get open source cell phones into the hands of poorer nations and poorer people. So when we look at this data, and we also see that the world is growing, which is obviously in many cases a bad thing, what we're seeing is hundreds of millions of new minds getting connected together via cell phones. They're getting access to technology, they're getting access to the internet, and therefore they're getting access to people. So in my mind, what we have is we're at this great intersection in history. And you know, one of the things I was chatting to a friend of mine the other night downstairs in the bar, and we were saying that we felt so lucky that we were born when we were born because we've got to see this story unfold. Like when I was a kid, computing existed, but it was really inaccessible. Not many people had computers. It was only when I got into my teens that they became kind of more accessible to people. And we're seeing this unfolding before our eyes. 3D printing in 50 years is going to be a whole world different than it is today, for example. So we're at this point where people are really getting connected, where we can do things. I mean, even bad voltage. The four of us live in completely different parts of the world. We'd never met in the same room until at SCaLE. So we're at this fantastic time. But what happens when we look at connected people, when we look at the principles of how connected people think and work together? And my view is that all connected people want to have a sense of purpose, is that whenever you join a community, all of you folks in here are in some form of community, and you want to have a sense of purpose within that community. And when you have that sense of purpose, you feel empowered. So when you're empowered, you have the ability to feel that drive to do something, to make a difference, to not just be another person building something that other people don't care about, and to go out there and do something. And when you have that sense of purpose, and when you are empowered, and when you achieve things, you get this incredible sense of belonging. And the thing that I've been rambling at now for about 5 years at SCaLE is that this is the most important thing we have to do when building communities, is that when you feel like you belong, when you feel like you're part of something, the world is your oyster, and you'll stick around for as long as you can. The most expensive thing in any community is what I call drive-by computers. It's drive-by contributors. It's people who show up for a couple of weeks. They go pedal to the metal and contribute, do loads of amazing work, and then they get distracted and leave. What we want is people sticking around for 5 years or 10 years, for example, and it's when they have that sense of belonging. Now, I believe I'm a very simple person, as most of you will know, and I believe there's two types of communities out there. I call them read and write. So read communities, these are like clubs. They're people who get together because of shared interest. So they may be fans of Lord of the Rings or Taylor Swift. Or pick whatever you want. But they're people who get together because they're interested in something. They don't generally create the thing that brings them together. They don't contribute to Taylor Swift's music, for example. And if you look at communities that are read, a lot of these are, for example, social media. So if you look at Twitter, we've seen this incredible growth happening on Twitter. And if you look at Facebook as well, we've seen incredible growth there. I was a little afraid to type in Google Plus to see what that growth is like. I don't think Google publishes that graph, which is it's a shame because I love Google Plus. Anyone use Google Plus in here? Isn't it awesome? But all of your friends who are not technical think you're weird, right, for using Google Plus. Same here. All right. So if we look at right communities, these are communities who get together to build something collaboratively, the thing that brings them together they can actually have an input on. And open source is obviously a brilliant example of that. But if you look at Wikipedia, we can see that we've seen fantastic contributor growth there. OpenStreetMap, which is kind of open source Google Maps, fantastic growth. If you look at open source as a whole, we've seen fantastic growth across the wide breadth of open source projects. And then if you look at 3D printing as well, people working together to create shapes that they can print out on their 3D printers, massive growth as well. So the conclusion that I came to when I started thinking about this is that technology is growing. We can see that with Moore's law. Access to tools and knowledge via the internet and low-cost devices and things like that is growing, but also communities are growing as well. So when you put all of this data together, in my mind, it creates this amazing opportunity, right? We look at this data over here, and if we know that technology is going to be at this particular point in 2 or 3 years, and we know that people are going to have access to the internet, and maybe we're going to have more and more people in developing nations and things like that have access to technology, then we can think of really bold and audacious goals. And it's the bold and audacious goals that get people revved up about participating, in my mind. Look at Jimmy Wales. When he's not asking you for money on Wikipedia, he had the idea of documenting human knowledge on a website. I mean, that's a pretty big goal. And they went out and they did it, and they, to a reasonable extent, have succeeded. And that was, I don't think he had that kind of the data that demonstrated that was going to be doable. But when you look at the data, it means that your bold and audacious goal isn't just fantasy. It means that you have actually got the opportunity to do something like that. So this brings us to XPRIZE. For those of you who don't know what XPRIZE is, it's a non-profit foundation that's mission statement is to solve humanity's grand challenges. So this is space travel, for example. The very first XPRIZE was to build a spaceship that would go up and down into space twice within 2 weeks, carrying a crew of 3 people. It was a $10 million competition, and it was won by SCaLE Composites, who built Spaceship One, that was then sold to Richard Branson, and that's Virgin Galactic. That was the first XPRIZE. We've seen other XPRIZes around a variety of other areas. But the idea here is that we have these major problems in the world, and we have technology that can fix it. And all we need to do is to incentivize how people can build that technology to fix it. And XPRIZE does this with these massive competitions, right? So a good example of this is the Global Learning XPRIZE. Anyone familiar with this? Anyone heard of this? I didn't think many of you would have heard of this. So this is the very first open source XPRIZE. It's a $15 million competition to build a piece of open source software that runs on an Android tablet that will teach a child how to read, write, and perform basic arithmetic within 18 months without the aid of a teacher. There's 54 million children in the world today who have no access to education, and there's 250 million children in the world who have access to primary education but don't have basic levels of literacy. 250 million kids. And UNESCO has done research into this and identified that if you help people to become literate, it helps to bring nations out of poverty, because people can access the wealth of information that's on the internet, they can set up small businesses and things like that. Families start getting smaller. There's families in Africa, for example, who deliberately have a lot of children because they need a child to look after the farm. Sadly, they account for a child that's probably going to die because of poor health care. So what happens is you have overpopulation. All these different things are connected together. So we set this grand challenge of how we're going to fix it. And the future vision that we look at is a more literate world that will help eradicate poverty. This isn't just about teaching kids how to read. This is absolutely about trying to identify these major problems and the knock-on effects that go after them as well. Okay? It's open source. There's going to be 5 teams who will be finalists in this, and those 5 teams will all be required to open source their software. All of the assets, all of the code will have to be open source. It'll be under the Apache license and under the Creative Commons licenses as well. So, XPRIZE was founded by this guy. He's called Peter Diamandis. I just want to set the record straight. A few people have commented to me since I joined XPRIZE that I seem to only want to work for crazy space-related millionaires. You're not the only one who's worried about this worrying trend. So he's a great guy, and he's essentially a futurist, and he's unbelievably passionate about this. He wrote a book called Abundance, and I really recommend you check it out. It's a fascinating book that really kind of maps out the challenges that we have in the world and how we can, get out there and fix them. And I was introduced to him. So, do any of you remember the Ubuntu Edge campaign? Yeah, big crowdfunding campaign that we didn't win and succeed at. Yeah. New book, Bold. Yeah, he's got a new book out. It's excellent. So I got introduced to Peter Diamandis through Indiegogo because I was one of the members of the team on the Ubuntu Edge campaign, and he was interested in crowdfunding, and then had a chat with him, and I said, the thing that's cool about XPRIZE is that you've got this way of incentivizing why we solve these problems. The reason why these competitions are $10 and $15 million, I mean, the Google Lunar, for example, is an XPRIZE to get back to the moon, is a $30 million competition, and it's in the final stages. I said to him, that's great, but these XPRIZes are 3 to 5 years long. You're going to have a small number of people who are going to actually want to participate in that. They're going to have the time and the energy and be able to raise the capital to participate in an XPRIZE like that. So in reality, you're not going to be able to really tap into the talent in the world. And coming from the open source community, we're surrounded by that talent. So to me, it's like, why don't you build a community around solving the major problems in the world? And he said, that's a great idea. You should come and do that for me. Which I didn't really want to do, if I'm being honest with you, because I was quite happy at Canonical. But then I started thinking about, this is a great opportunity to kind of learn how to build communities in different ways. So I set myself the mission statement of, I want XPRIZE to be the way in which anyone with passion and talent can have a practical effect in changing the world. In my mind, anyone can wake up in the morning and say, I want to eradicate illiteracy, and I want to improve space travel, and I want to help cure Alzheimer's. Anyone can wake up with great intentions. But how do we actually practically connect people with skills and with talents? The thing that's amazing about open source is that we can practically connect people. You see a cool project, it needs help, we can find the people who can help that out, right? So it's got to be practical, and that's the goal of the work that's going on here. Now, I spent nearly 8 years at Canonical, and it was an amazing experience being there and learning how to work on an open source community and how to build an open source community. And I knew that going from Canonical to XPRIZE was going to be different, and it was going to be a challenge, and it was going to get me out of my comfort zone. And frankly, it was a conscious decision to get me out of my comfort zone, because I don't believe that you can be anywhere for 8 years and not start getting a bit lazy. So I knew that it was going to be in a bit of an uphill struggle, and that's the reason why I said at the beginning of this presentation, this is a selfish presentation, okay? So I left Canonical and joined XPRIZE, and realize this is going to be kind of here be dragons territory, okay? Go back. That this is a completely different world. And my thinking was the best way in which I can kind of get ahead and do a reasonable job and learn how to build a community that I'm not aware of any community that's doing this, that is trying to provide kind of a connection point, an on-ramp to how you make the world as a whole a better planet, okay? And that's going to span off in lots of different areas. How do you make the world a better place in terms of ocean health and acidification? How do you contribute towards curing diseases and things like that? How do we, for example, pull medical data out of medical institutions, put it into the cloud, provide a good set of tools so armchair scientists can contribute towards curing cancer, to curing Alzheimer's and things like that? We have the cloud, we have the technology, we just need to build the tools and connect the right people to it, right? It's all doable. So in my mind, I know that it's possible, and the goal is over there where that speaker is. I just have no real idea of what the path is going to be. So I started looking into various organizations and looking at open source, of course, Wikipedia, interested in organizations like Local Motors and how GitHub works, and just trying to go into this with, I'm not going to try and assume that I have all the answers here. And one of the most prevalent elements here, of course, is open source. We live and breathe open source every single day. So I was primarily using that as my reference point of how do we go out there and build this community. In doing so, I realized that there's a lot of layers to that particular onion. And this is where I find it quite interesting, is that if you look at any open source organization, when I was at Canonical, there was just a set of known elements and assumptions and standard procedures that are just inherently collaborative and inherently community-orientated. So put aside, those of you who don't particularly like Canonical, put aside that hatred for a second. You can pick any other open source company. But just open source organizations and people are just inherently collaborative. We naturally think in ways that we can work together. We collaborate over email. We collaborate over IRC and Hangouts. We naturally think about, okay, well, we have an idea for something. Let's go and do it. We're agile. We're at times scrappy. But it's very much proactive. It's not reactive. And one of the things that was interesting about going to XPRIZE is that that's an environment where that culture doesn't really exist. I was expecting XPRIZE to be kind of like the basement in Tony Stark's house in Iron Man, with like robot lasers and all kinds of stuff, right? And it really isn't. It's an organization that puts together big competitions to solve these problems in the world. Speaking of robots, this guy walking in at the back actually works on really cool robots. You should go and talk to him. So, but yeah, there's all of these. So I came into XPRIZE and realized there is a lot that we take for granted in this world. And some of you who don't work in the open source industry will know this, because you'll come to SCaLE and you'll see all of this, and it's abundantly clear. So I realized that in infusing this new community with the principles and the guidelines of how open source works, there's kind of two layers. We need to kind of get out there why community is interesting, why, and to demonstrate the point of it. Like if I go to any open source conference, if I go to any technology conference, we all know that this stuff works. We all know that open source works and that the people are doing great things with it. But that's the first layer that I realized I'm going to have to work on. And it took me a long time, frankly, because I'm an idiot, to realize that. But then the second layer is to produce like all of these different on-ramps of, okay, how do we actually do this? And, again, I've realized I don't have all the answers. I don't want to go into this with all of the answers. So what I'm here to do is I'm going to get through this as quickly as I can. And I'd love to hear your feedback and ideas, because I want to make sure that as we build this new community out, that it's not just something that some balding English guy tells us how to do it, okay? It's like there's this amazing book. Have any of you read a book called The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People? Shut up, by the way, because I keep telling him to read it. I thought this was going to be like those really annoying marketing people who blather on about get-rich-quick schemes and all that kind of stuff. I thought it was going to be like that. A friend of mine recommended that I read it, and it really isn't. It's a book that teaches you like the basic principles that make people good human beings and how to harness that in different ways. It was really, really helpful. And one of the things that he talks about in that book is if you're going to build anything new, a company, an organization, a community, a family, you can't just have the people at the top who are in charge make the decisions and then just push it down to the ranks. You can do that, but it won't work as well. So So if you're crafting your mission statement or your values or all of those different pieces, you want to kind of work together with people. And then it feels like everybody feeds into that process. And I've wanted to do that from day one with XPRIZE, is how do we work together? How do we define our community mission statement? How do we define our values and things like that? So I'd really like to invite your input when I'm done with this and you know, before I leave and things like that, and over email and everything else, for you to come and help shape this as well. Because I wasn't kidding when I said I was being selfish. I need your help. So I'm going to talk through a couple of areas where I've been thinking about this and about how we can get started. And my view has been, I put together a 2015 plan for XPRIZE, and I thought, we'll experiment with these areas. I made it very clear to XPRIZE, this is a shot in the dark, right? This stuff probably won't work, and some of it will work. You know, there's a kind of an ancient management philosophy of the idea that you have in your head, you will get there. It just won't really be what you expect it to be when you get there. It'll be quite different. And that's my viewpoint with this. So we have this XPRIZE, the global learning XPRIZE. It's open source. The first thing I thought was cooperation, right? Is that we see this a lot in open source. Look at OpenStack. Loads of big companies who compete with each other, collaborating around the pieces that they all need. The kernel is another good example of that. So this seems logical, but what we do, for example, is we have a bunch of teams who compete in this XPRIZE. Let's say there's 3 teams here, A, B, and C. And then what we do is we identify what are the common pieces that these teams are going to want to work on. Maybe it's a storytelling platform, or maybe it's voice recognition. Big voice recognition systems are primarily proprietary. And kids who can't read are probably going to interact with these tablets via voice recognition, for example. Maybe we can build a speech corpus. But we identify these pieces and we put together an open source set of components. We set up GitHub repositories for each of them, and we get people involved. This now means that outside of the teams, other developers who are not involved in the XPRIZE teams can come and participate as well. So if you don't have the time to devote to for a full XPRIZE team, you've got a way in which you can put your stamp in making the planet a better place, okay? Then what happens is these 3 teams put their solutions forward. Let's say this one down here, Team B, wins. And then at this point, when this is open sourced fully, we now have a project in which not just the team that won it can contribute, but also other people and external developers can contribute to it as well. And because one of the things I said to XPRIZE when I joined was, you can't just take a big chunk of code that's been proprietary and then dump it on the internet. It's going to rot on the vine, right? You've got to have a developer community that wraps around it. So in my mind, this is how we can explore those ways of doing things. But the other thing is, as I said earlier on, XPRIZE is cool because we have these reasons to solve these major challenges. And one of the things that's fascinating about the incentive model, which I never knew about, you know, one of the first major incentive competitions, and what was the inspiration for XPRIZE, was the first transatlantic flight, the Spirit of St. Louis. That was a $100,000 competition put up by a rich hotelier who was ultimately won. I think it was about $300,000 of R&D went into it, but you only paid the winner. And what it did is that all the people who invested the time and the energy and the expense into it, they then end up with essentially startup companies. So it acts almost like a bit of an incubator. And this is the same thing here, $15 million competition, but the top 5 teams, I'm almost certain, are all going to have organizations that are going to be building products around this as well, but it's all based upon an open source platform. So now at that point we have an open source code base that's teaching children how to read and write and count that can live on many years after the end of the XPRIZE. However, we want more people involved, and this is where I've been kind of trying to think, how do we broaden this out? How do we get more people fixing our planet? Because every one of us can do something. So this is my idea, and this is, again, I'd love your input on this fairly soon. The way I look at it is this. You've got these big problems up here, grand challenges. This is, our oceans are disgusting in certain parts of the world. The river Ganges, for example, a lot of people, they drink from it, they bathe in it, their loved ones, when they pass away, go into the river Ganges. We should try and clean that. That's just one example of a challenge. There's all of these major things. There is space travel, and there's life sciences, and all these different pieces. And then down here, we've got innovators and technologists. Now, in my mind, there's a difference between those 2 words. I think innovators are people who have really good ideas for technology, but they don't really have the chops themselves to do it. So a lot of founders of startup companies are like that. They have huge vision, but they need a really good team to be able to execute it. And then technologists is a kind of a broad term for developers and translators and docs writers and all people who've got a skill, a very practical vocational skill that they can contribute, okay? A lot of technologists actually need the innovators to kind of set the path moving forward. XPRIZE sits in the middle of all this. So what XPRIZE does is it can look at these big challenges up here. It can say, okay, we know that we have a problem, for example, that millions of kids around the world can't read. And then XPRIZE does this really quite intensive prize development process. It goes through this intensive prize development process that takes 2 or 3 years where they work with consultants and they say, where will the technology be when we want this to finish? How long does the competition need to be? What's the market going to look like? Like, you can create open source software that can teach millions of kids to read, but how do you get it into the hands of those kids? How do you test it? In this competition, for example, in the Global Learning XPRIZE, there's an 18-month development phase where you build the software, and then there's going to be 18 months of field testing where you actually put it in the hands of real kids using real tablets to actually make sure that it works. So it's a very, very elaborate process. And that's great because we have a bunch of these different XPRIZes. But the open source person in me thinks, there's loads of other smaller problems up there. Like, imagine if UNESCO, for example, said, we don't have a good crisis management system. Imagine if they said, when there's a tsunami, there's an earthquake, something like that, people need to find food, they need to find shelter, they need to find their loved ones. But we don't have a good platform that's going to be available via cell phones because that's how people get connected and things like that. What about maybe a mesh network of people that can get connected to each other in that situation? When I think of that from an open source perspective, I think, well, if we got like 4 or 5 web developers together, a couple of QA people, some designers, set up a GitHub repository, some bug tracking, we could build something like that, right? That's what we do. That's what open source people do. We think of something, we get out there and do it, right? So in my mind, there is thousands of these little problems all over the world. And we've got thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people down here who could help fix them. And I did some back-of-the-napkin polls on Google+, where I wanted to test my assumption, because I was under the impression that most people who contribute to open source do it because they want to make the world a better place. And then I met Linus Torvalds. I was interviewing him for a video, and he was like, I don't contribute towards the kernel. I didn't start Linux because I want to make the world a better place. That's cool and all, but I do it because I want to build a kernel. So I wanted to check my assumption that I wasn't being overly philanthropic about things. So I did a bit of back-of-the-napkin poll to a lot of people who follow me on G+ are open source people. And broadly, the results of that was a lot of people do contribute because they want to make the world a better place. However, it's got to be technically interesting. Something that is very philanthropic but isn't an interesting challenge is boring to people. So in my mind, that's a nice little set of guidelines to, okay, how do we direct these people down here to these problems in a way that's fulfilling? And that's something that this is at the embryonic stage of thinking. So this is, again, lots of guidance, lots of input would be very, very welcome. But this raises, you know how I talked about the onions, and the layers of the onion. What this opens up as a challenge to me is how we do this in a sustainable way. One of the principles that Mark Shuttleworth set in place at Canonical with Ubuntu is the notion of, there was a conversation years ago about how do you define what good contributors look like. And his view was, they don't just contribute significant things, they contribute in a sustained manner. So you want somebody who's going to do lots of good work for a longer period of time, okay? And likewise, what we don't want is 100,000 GitHub repositories of old code that no one's using, right? We want to maintain projects that live on. And this is where I think one of the challenges that we have here is the kind of hacker versus maintainer role that a lot of us have. So I am a awful programmer. Shut up. I know you're going to say something. Look the other way. I'm a pretty poor programmer. I'm not as bad as he thinks I am. But I'm a hacker. I write a piece of software. Like we did this Ubuntu accomplishment system, which is gamification for Ubuntu. I spent every evening of my life just hammering at this thing and finally got this elaborate thing together. And as soon as it hit essentially the first version, I was completely uninterested in it. Like, it got to the point where you have to maintain it and that fix people's bugs, and I was just bored instantly. But then you have other people who maintain stable branches who actually like building a really rigorous, solid piece of software. And I think we have two mindsets in the open source world, largely. And we want to inspire the hackers to come out there and innovate to solve these things in the world, but then we also want them to be in a maintainable way. So there's lots of ideas I had around about this, things like, hackathons. Hackathons are great for getting people together, getting developers to hang out and talk with each other. But how do we take the output of that hackathon and transition that into a maintainable project? Because a lot of hackathons are great for people getting together, but they produce toys at the end of it. So these are the kind of thinking some of the thinking I've been having. But again, I don't have all the answers. But I think that we do as a community. So for those of you who leave today, I'd like to encourage you to go to forum.xprize.org, which is our online community forum that we set up a little while back. And this is the ground floor of a new community, so lots of the pieces are not quite in there yet. We don't have the community.xprize.org website up yet, for example. We're just starting out. But this is a place where I'd love to hear your feedback and ideas and perspectives on this. But while we're here, what do you folks think? Let me ask you the question, how do we build, or how do you think we can connect smart people with skills, with talents, to solve these big problems in the world? Any ideas? Thoughts? They can be as small or as large as you like.
Several years ago, a gentleman named Nicholas Negroponte had a crazy idea of making a $100 laptop. And at the time, laptops were $1,500, $2,000. And he got a lot of skeptics. How do you make a laptop for $100 and then make enough of them to distribute to children? And that became the one laptop per child program. Did you have any thoughts, or have you studied one laptop per child? Do you have any thoughts on perhaps lessons learned that you could apply to XPRIZE?
Sure. So Nicholas Negroponte actually worked at XPRIZE for a while. And the guy who is running the prize, who's running the Global Learning XPRIZE, is a guy called Matt Keller, who worked with Nicholas Negroponte on one laptop per child. And then the technical director of that particular XPRIZE is a guy called Ed McNerney, who's an awesome dude as well. And I think the general feeling at XPRIZE is, in many ways, the hardware there is not really the market opportunity for building a solution that will bring literacy to all of these kids, because it's not just about writing the software and making the hardware. It's, for example, getting getting those tablets out to people in parts of the world where roads don't exist, for example. So I think the idea here was open source people are inherently collaborative. If we have a big competition to build technology, once we have that killer app, essentially, that will incentivize the hardware companies to build tablets that are going to be much more resistant to sand and dust and things like that. You couldn't just take a regular tablet and throw it out into some of these regions of the world that break instantly. So to use that as kind of the carrot, and then the other bits will wrap around it. I think that's the thinking of it. If anyone's got any questions, if you don't want to come up with ideas, you're welcome to as well.
I have a question about the Global Learning XPRIZE. One of the things that I was wondering... Sorry. Did you guys think about the long-term economic viability of it? And the reason why I asked that question, I know XPRIZE isn't about making money, but if you do something like the Global Learning XPRIZE and there's not enough money in it to sustain the infrastructure around the hardware and the software, because you need power, you need people to maintain the hardware that runs the software, and you need people to maintain the software, it would just fizzle, and you wouldn't make a long-term impact. You'd make a short-term impact.
One of the things that I learned from reading his book, Abundance, is, because until a week or two before I joined XPRIZE, I knew nothing about philanthropy and solving major problems in the world, so I thought I should read his book. First rule of going to work for a new company, read the founder's book. Is that all of these things are connected. To your point, if you build this software, which could be really transformative, you need the technology, you need the tablets, but then you also need to be able to power them. And there are various technologies out there for powering, hardware and all the rest of it. And there are other X Prizes in development to solve some of these pieces. I think it was, for example, there was one technology that he mentions in the book around, I think it was around burning dung and using that as a means to generate power. And then, of course, the solar, which is getting increasingly cheap as well. But it's one of those things whereby if you try to come up with a solution where you tick all of the boxes, you'd have like the $7 billion Fix Humanity X Prize that you could never do. So it's like trying to pick these things off in a way that's kind of planned. And there is very much a goal of when the winners, once they succeed, there's a plan to really help them to be successful as well. There's almost like an incubator piece at the end of it that will help them to get connected to the hardware companies. The idea is that this software will be on every cell phone, on every tablet in the world. Loads of hands now.
So this is kind of thoughts and question, but have you looked at doing sort of regional collaborations and reaching out to maybe like universities and other nonprofits that might be similar minded and maybe bringing these together in, I mean, the hackathon concept is really awesome, but like you said, there's a lot of output for that day or two, but nothing comes out after. But maybe if these groups, like a university brings in their group and has a team, and whoever comes out of that gets a mentor, that one kind of keeps them accountable to continuing it, but also helps them with the development, because then it's they're learning, they're producing something, and they're also helping the community in one way. Because we'll have a lot of that stuff here in Los Angeles, like civic hackathons. There's one next weekend that is around building socially minded mobile apps, but I think after that weekend, it's just keeping it going. So maybe linking them in, having a mentor or someone from X Prize to help continue that. It's just some thoughts that I'm throwing out there.
That's awesome, and this is exactly the kind of thing I don't like my sound my own voice as it is, let alone standing next to that thing. I think, that's exactly the kind of thing that I'd love to explore and get feedback from people, is like, what are the best ways in which we can kind of kickstart this and trigger this? Because I think this is a great opportunity to genuinely make the world a better place. But there's a limited set of resources now to do that. So one of the things that I have started working on are what we're calling X Prize think tanks. And they're basically, for all intents and purposes, people who get together to form local groups. Because I think we often forget how powerful local communities can be. I mean, a good example of this is SCaLE. We're all in the same room, we're having fun, and we get to that meet space that we're in is fantastic, and we often forget about that. So it's like identifying these groups, but again, that are very focused on practical doing. Because anyone can get in a room with a bunch of like-minded people and feel great and have a nice conversation, but I'd like to identify ways in which we can really connect those people at the end of a conversation to, okay, what can we now do? Let's all take a work item and do something to move that forward. The idea of working with universities is one that I hadn't considered. I think that's a really cool idea. And maybe other kind of similarly minded groups as well. Because the goal here as well is not to create like a single behemoth organization that everybody has to go through. Is that this is very much X Prize is kind of the dating site of connecting people to these challenges in practical ways. Richard.
You mentioned Apache license for the education initiative, and I like many licenses for many different reasons, but I often prefer GPL for educational projects because that seems a good fit. Why Apache for this project?
Yeah. I knew I was going to get that question. It was, so the way, stand up here, the way in which these X Prizes work is when an X Prize is announced, there is a document called the prize guidelines, and then basically it's like, this is the way we think it should work, and then there is a 6-month period where people can have a request for comment, and people can say, oh, we should do it this way, should do it that way, and there's been some questions about the choice of license for the Global Learning X Prize. There's a couple of considerations that went into the Apache license, and I'm not a licensing expert by any stretch of the imagination, but one is that we want to build a foundation of open source technology, which is completely open source, completely free, everybody can get access to. But we also want to entertain the idea that people could build other things that sit on top of it that might not be open source. Because then what you do is you can create an ecosystem. So if you have this solid open source code base, You then may get a company that invests a ton of money in building a piece that fits on top of that. And then hardware manufacturers and other people can choose to ship that or not ship that. But it's the quality of the output is the consideration. This is the continuing trend that I think we're seeing in Silicon Valley with startups. I know very few startups who generally ship anything under GPL. And I'm a GPL guy. Like, GPL is where my heart is because I want it to be inherently open in all possible situations. So the Apache license that we felt was kind of like a good compromise where you require the code in that particular, in that foundation foundational open source technology to be open, but then you can have these pieces that could sit on top of it. The other benefit of the Apache license is it's very well understood. We absolutely did not want to make our own, the XPRIZE public license. But then the other thing is that there's an auto granting of patents as well. So when you contribute towards an APL project, then you basically say the patents that may be covered by this will automatically be granted over there as well. So that was the choice, although it is not a fixed decision. So if anybody's got feedback about whether we should be using something else, someone actually suggested to me a few weeks ago when I talked about this, you should check out the Eclipse public license, because there are some elements of the APL that are not perfect. No license is perfect, but he was of the view that the Eclipse public license might be a good alternative. Thank you.
So I was wondering about data access. With software, you can usually just go out and write software, but if you want to cure cancer, you're going to need data from lots of medical surveys and things like that, experiments. What do you do with that?
I'm glad that you asked about this. If I'm being quite honest with you, when I was at Canonical, I was not particularly interested in the cloud. Because I was involved in it very much at the component level. You know, as we were building Ubuntu and Juju and stuff like that. And then from leaving Canonical and thinking that this kind of stuff, it becomes evident like what you can do with the cloud and just the application of the cloud in so many different areas. And that got me thinking and talking with some other people at XPRIZE, like, how can we use that as a tool to find solutions to some of these challenges? And that's when I started thinking about things like big data. So, for example, I'm about to join, this is a separate thing to XPRIZE, but I'm about to join a board for this organization that's wanting to pull out genomics data and put it into the cloud and then be able to do essentially empower armchair scientists to go in there and contribute in different ways. In my mind, the processing power is there. The data is one piece, but invariably that you can get the data out, that's probably going to be tied up in a certain amount of legalese. The real challenge is once you've got the data, and once you've got it in the cloud, is what's the interface to allow people to process it. I can't remember what it was, I think it was NASA did this. They had an issue years ago where they were trying to find certain patterns in some astronomical data, and they didn't have software that could identify these patterns. I think a lot of it was kind of like visual analysis. So they basically dumped it on the internet. And what was going to take them an estimated like year to process, they managed to process in like 2.5 weeks with people. So in my mind, that tells a story that like there's loads of different opportunities for how we can do this. And that's one thing that I'm just starting to learn about now is, okay, well, how do we pull out these different pieces of data, and what's the right way in which we can connect people to them? It seems to me a largely user interface oriented problem. Like if you're an expert in, if you're a surgeon or you're in the medical field, and you have this data, like what lens do you look at it through? So you can take that out, pull out patterns, connect those patterns in ways that maybe guide further tests and infrastructure. So
where you have the various things like SETI and what have you, where you're doing the distributed. Somebody remember the? Yeah. What was that? Yes. Yes. The distributed computing projects. You might be able to tie that into this. I do have a question though about specifically the learning program. You didn't say specifically, but that is, I'm assuming, specified to be in the English language, because I'm wondering to what extent language itself is going to form either a barrier or an additional problem for your project. because, you know, other languages aren't structured in the same way, and literacy is very geared towards the language.
It's a great question. You know, when we put out the request for comments for the Global Learning X Prize, there was really two areas where people were most interested in having conversation. One was the license, and one was the choice of language. I believe currently the choice of language is going to be English. The feeling being that English it's a pretty dominant language in the world. So invariably what's going to happen, these kids are going to learn it, and then what they'll do is they'll get connected into the internet, and there's so much online that's in English that they can then continue their learning and all the rest of it. However, the belief here is that we are, to a reasonable extent, expecting teams to be able to build technology that could conceivably be localized in different ways as well. So it may be in Swahili or something else. But it is very much... Right. Exactly. And this is where we've had this great discussion going on the forum around building the speech corpus. You know, you could build a speech corpus around English, but we may need a bunch of other languages. But again, maybe a way in which people can contribute towards helping this Global Learning X Prize is if people can read out a story, and then they can that can get recorded and then used in something like Pocket Sphinx. We can process that, and then that can expand the speech corpus. But the language issue, it is a problem. I think in a perfect world, this would work in all languages, because one of the key pieces of feedback that we've had is, you know, what about, you know, this is particularly in America, is what about American children? There's a lot of kids in America who are illiterate. There's a lot of kids in Africa and in Asia that are illiterate. So our view was, let's start somewhere, but this again to me is a great opportunity for open source, is that let's say the prize guidelines are English. What if a bunch of us want to make it work really well in Swahili? And then we can identify the pieces that are language centric, and we can optimize those for different languages.
Part of the problem I'm thinking of, and I'm not a linguist, I studied enough languages to know that that language families are very different in terms of their grammatical structure. So Spanish and Portuguese seem very different from English, but they're actually fairly similar, at least in their grammar. Right. So you could probably translate software to do that. But if you're starting to deal with languages from the Indian subcontinent, you're now dealing in a completely different kettle of fish. Yeah. Fortunately, in one sense, they have English is a common language down there. But if you start getting into other parts of Asia, you get into family groups where Western language grammar does not apply.
Language is also heavily influenced by culture. Do you feel that having it in English would sort of force the English culture?
You know what? That's a great question, and I don't really have a good answer to that. I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I think the view that we have is this is a starting point, and it gives a good framework for a starting point. The thing that I'm excited about is that in 5 years, when this prize finishes, we will have a piece of open source software that will be fueling literacy in the world, which I think is awesome. And I think we can all play a role in doing that. I was given the 2-minute warning about 2 minutes ago, so I apologize that I can't get to your question. I just want to say, again, I was petrified that no one was going to show up to this. And thank you for sitting and watching this. I hope you have a great rest of the SCaLE. And go there and come and help us do this. Thank you.